I today am going to talk about workers' inquiry and why they're important and how they can contribute to worker self-organization and strike-related activity, and understanding also the role of workers' inquiries in identifying global choke points. So I want to start off by talking a little bit about the global working class. We know that the working class is getting its ass kicked in so many different ways. We all know about declining numbers of strikes. We know about how organizing has been replaced by advocacy and collective bargaining and the use of grievances and mobilization. The number of strikes has declined to historically low numbers. Even membership in unions and what's called density has dropped significantly. I was just reading yesterday that globally, the number of unionized workers has dropped from 36 to 18% in just 20 years. We also are well aware that unions have been harnessed to neoliberal capitalist parties, that unions has also transformed themselves in their focus to just working on wages and benefits for members. They ignore the issue of work, the struggle over work, and the question of power. Many unions, when workers do belong to them, are focused on different approaches that are called everything from interest-based bargaining to non-zero-sum game bargaining to bargaining for the common good. All of these have displaced and replaced organizing workers for power. And yet what's amazing through all of this is that workers are still organizing. People are still organizing in the waged workplace, organizing various kinds of struggles, wildcat strikes, and engaged in various forms of disruption across many different countries in many continents. So I wanted to try to understand this almost complete paradox. How can it be that when we look at the formal numbers, when we look at the reports, when we look at the media accounts, it looks like class struggle is on the decline, and yet all around the world, workers are still organizing, still engaged in forms of self-organization and disruptive activity. So I think in order to try to understand this, I wanted to build upon previous efforts that have been made over previous decades at using what's called a workers' inquiry. And I wanted to take up this call to start the process of a global workers' inquiry. After all, capitalism is global. And so should class struggle be. And this call was made by an independent British theorist, thinker, translator, editor, Ed Emery, in 1995 in a journal that was published in the UK for about a decade or so called Common Sense, a very accessible little journal. And in a piece that Ed Emery wrote in 1995, he took up this idea that had begun with Karl Marx. The last thing Marx had ever written and published was a 100-question survey that he referred to as a workers' inquiry for French workers. It was in French in a newspaper. And sadly, historians have said that he never got a response. But over 60 years or so, it had been forgotten. And then it was rediscovered in the 1950s and 1960s, simultaneously by small, what today we would call autonomous Marxist groups in France and Italy, and then later in the 70s in the US. And workers had been working with academics and independent scholars to take up this idea of doing an inquiry into work. But Ed Emery said in this piece, he said that the enemy constantly studies class composition in order to fracture it, to break it, to disperse it, permanently dissipate its strength. We, for our part, study class composition in order to strengthen it, consolidate it, and turn it into a real basis of power. At the moment, we know just about fuck all. He continued that we have to muster all available forces to work on a militant class composition study project. This is to inform and to be the basis of possible future political organization. Before we can make politics, Ed said, we have to understand that class composition. This requires us to study it, to analyze it. And we do this through a process of inquiry. Hence, no politics without inquiry. And so I took Ed's call really seriously when I started assembling what was first a series of articles for the Journal of Labor and Society, where I'm also the book editor, and then expanded what I had received into this book. I took it seriously that we really need to begin a global inquiry. Now, that inquiry can't be static. It has to constantly be moving with the dynamic of worker struggles and the changes in the class composition of capital, the capital composition. So this is really a snapshot in time. And so in putting this book together, I ended up with workers' inquiries written by people at their own work or independent scholars working with workers at work, that covered 9 countries on 3 continents with about half the world's population. And just to give you an overview of what the chapters cover is contingent miners and service workers in South Africa, contingent factory workers and the response of the state in China, contingent auto workers in India, public school teachers in Mexico, logistics warehouse workers and the struggle to overcome racial and immigration status divisions in Italy, truckers and logistic workers in Argentina, university professors, which I wrote in California with a strike threat that my union had taken, transport logistics workers in Turkey, and then gamers, platform workers, call center workers, retail, and cleaners in the UK. And so we brought these workers' inquiries together because there's a shared recognition among the contributors and others who are using workers' inquiry that we need different tactics and strategies. And this is something that was taken up when Marx's approach was reignited or rediscovered by the French group Socialisme ou Barbarie and the Italian group around Quaderni Rossi. And essentially the concern is around understanding how capital is organized and how workers are organized and how this dynamic functions. Now, to understand the role of workers' inquiry in this context, it's important to pair workers' inquiry with what's called class composition theory. So class composition theory, which I'll talk a little bit about, is the theoretical basis for understanding this dynamic, or what I call the spiral dance. And the workers' inquiry is the method by which you can examine and understand the class composition and the changes in order to prepare tactics and strategies to respond. So there's essentially 3 objectives of this use of class composition theory and workers' inquiry together. These 3 objectives begin with the use of workers' inquiry to understand what is called the technical composition of capital. And this is something that was also taken up, as I mentioned, in the 1970s by a group in the US that called themselves Midnight Notes. So understanding the technical composition of capital means looking at the workplace. And again, this can be done in a single workplace. It can be done through an entire firm, or if it's the public sector, through an entire agency or department, or it can be done throughout an entire industry. So in trying to understand the technical composition, you're asking a series of questions. Is first, what is capital's current strategy for imposing work? How is work organized? And what's the division of labor? What's the current management strategy involving technology, wages, insourcing or outsourcing, etc.? And then finally, how is the global supply chain organized? These are four important key questions. There are others that can be asked, but within the scope of these four overarching thematic questions, you can drill down into the specifics of where you're doing the inquiry and identify issues that you need to know to understand essentially how are workers having work imposed on them and exploited in the workplace. And essentially, how is work currently organized? I think to really understand why this is so important, I want to share with you a thought of the Italian autonomous Marxist Maria Rosa della Costa and the American Selma James, who wrote in their 1972 book, Women in the Subversion of Community, that the technological innovations and cooperation are at the same time moments of attack for the working class and moments of capitalist response. So this is part of that dynamic. So you begin to understand this dynamic by beginning to understand how work is organized and how work is imposed. That's the first element. The second element is to use workers' inquiry to understand the existing composition of the working class. So the first element was understanding the composition of capital. So the current class composition is the capital composition. So how is capital organized? How does it impose work? It's an important starting point. I'll swing back to this in a moment. So the second step now is to shift focus and look at how are workers organized? How are workers organized within the larger organization of the working class? So there's a few overarching questions we can get at here. First, how is capital's strategy in responding to the previous cycle of struggle decomposed working class power? So that tells us how the working class is currently organized. And the current organization of the working class and the mess that we find ourselves in is the result of the response of capital following the previous wave of struggle. So in other words, how are workers divided and reorganized by race, by gender, by reproductive labor, geography, legal status, wage, skills, housing status, immigration status? In other words, we're looking at the current organization of workers. How are they fragmented? How are they divided? I think a really good study that did this also was in the late 90s, early 2000s, a small anonymous group in Germany that put out their call center inquiry called Hotlines. A lot of this you can find online. A lot of the Italian and the French works have been translated and available, particularly on the Viewpoints website. So that's the second element. The first element is understanding how capital is organized currently. And then the second element is understanding how workers are composed. How are they part of the current composition of the working class? In other words, where do we find ourselves after the defeat of the last wave of struggle, or the last cycle of struggle? So the third element of class composition theory is to use workers' inquiry to identify new tactics and strategies that workers are using or can use to recompose our class power. So we understood capital, we understood workers. Now we try to use that knowledge, that information that we now have, to figure out new tactics and strategies by which we can overcome those divisions. So how can we organize in new ways and engage in new tactics and strategies that help us recompose our power? So rather than fighting according to the current composition, the current fragmented and divided situation that we find ourselves in, we devise new tactics and strategies to overcome those divisions so that we can recompose our power and start the new cycle. So there are several questions that can be asked. And again, these questions are not just limited to what I'm suggesting, but they can be developed by those who are doing an inquiry into their own situation. So first, what tactics and strategies work under the current technical composition of capital? So where we find ourselves in the current organizational work, what tactics and strategies are currently working? So we can learn from what workers are already doing in our own workplace or elsewhere and adapt them to our own situation. If we find that the technical composition, for example, has some analogies, some similarities. Second, how can the struggle that we're engaged in be circulated across workplaces, to different sectors, and across borders? So how can we share and connect the tactics and strategies that we're using? Also, very importantly, is where are the choke points? Where are the fundamental weak parts in the current composition of capital? Where is, for example, we're seeing during the pandemic, global supply chains have really become fragmented and have broken down. Now, that's the result in part due to worker struggles at critical leverage points, critical areas where there's leverage because of weaknesses, and also it has to do with throwing up various kinds of border protections due to the pandemic. So those are what we refer to as choke points. Those are weak areas where well-organized workers can disrupt production and have an effect that reverberates up and down the supply chain. These kinds of choke points can occur even in small workplaces, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. And then a last question for this third element is, which workers are strategically positioned at these choke points? And what's their current composition? Have they recomposed their power and applied their power as a pressure point to disrupt production? So these three different elements compose the beginnings of a workers' inquiry. These are the three elements of class composition theory that can help us identify the current situation of both how work is organized and how workers are organized or disorganized, and then figuring out what next steps to take, and then how to share and circulate and learn from what others are doing and develop new tactics and strategies, and then identifying where the weaknesses are in the organization of work, both in single workplaces, but also along the entire supply chain, whether it be a regional supply chain, national, or global supply chain, although increasingly almost every supply chain is now global. So workers' inquiry is an approach that can be critical and helpful and useful for workers themselves to figure out how to organize and to struggle. They can be done by the workers themselves or in collaboration with independent scholars. And then the question then becomes, well, what's the purpose of doing a workers' inquiry? The purpose of a workers' inquiry is not just about doing an academic exercise. It's not about writing a report or writing a book. It's about developing the knowledge, or what you might call a working class science, developing a body of knowledge that workers have acquired themselves or in partnership that they can apply in their own struggles. The purpose of a workers' inquiry is not just to get to the next contract, to succeed in collective bargaining, although it could be used for that purpose, but not exclusively so. A workers' inquiry is not a survey. It's not about just gathering information for the purposes of making demands. The purpose of a workers' inquiry is to recompose the working class as a force of struggle. Now, I apologize for the late start. We had some trouble with my ability to do a screen share. So unfortunately, I can't show something that I wanted to share with folks. And I was hoping to actually do this collectively with folks that showed up, but now I realize I'm not capable of doing that. And it's unfortunate I can't show this to you, but if you're interested in this, you can track me down and I'm happy to send it to you. But I work with someone in teaching folks how to begin to do a workers' inquiry in their own workplace. And your workplace can be a handful of people, it can be thousands of people or more. But the basic idea is to map out your workplace. And you can do this with a piece of paper and a pencil, is to draw a line from where you're located, your workplace, up the supply chain. So thinking about how your work feeds others' work. Do you produce goods or services that then feed into other workplaces? If so, where are they? What do they do? And then where do those workplaces in turn feed their goods and services into other workplaces? So essentially what you're beginning to do is map out your own supply chain. And then from the other side, draw another arrow going into your workplace and think about what feeds into your workplace, just like the ones that you are identifying that your workplace feeds into. You think about the ones that feed into yours. So what are the different inputs that are coming in, goods and services into your workplace? And then as you're doing this, as you're mapping this out, think about where the choke points are, where are the weaknesses. For example, if you work in an office, as many of us do, offices rely on lots of inputs, everything from electricity to having the door open to the supply of paper for machines, for support for computers, also the supply of food and other kinds of material that the office relies on. What feeds into those workplaces, providing the inputs into that office workplace, might be the delivery drivers who are delivering those goods. And prior to that, the packaging companies that are packaging those goods. And prior to that, the global shippers that are transporting those goods, because most of these basic goods now are coming globally from other places in the world. And then you reverse engineer, if you will, where these things are coming from. And then you end up with, in the case of, let's say, the electricity, we end up with, say, a hydroelectrical dam, which is where the power plant is. And all along the way, there are workers. There are waged workers in different workplaces and locations where their organization can be applied to a choke point that disrupts all the other workplaces that rely on it going all the way down. And as an educator, one of the important locations of all of these workplaces that feeds into each one is education. And that could be, secondary education, what we call in the United States up through high school. It could be community colleges, it could be trade schools, universities, and production of those trained, skilled, disciplined workers into those different workplaces, or all choke points as well. If students don't make it out with their degrees, there's not enough labor to supply those workplaces. So mapping out that workplace is something that we do. And my expectation was to have you all work to map out your workplaces and then identify these choke points. So when you're doing this, if you decide to do this on your own, I suggest asking yourself 3 questions as you start mapping out the supply chain, because every workplace has a supply chain. We tend to think about supply chains as all being global, but they can also be very localized as well. So the first question to ask is, what are the potential choke points and vulnerabilities in your workplace that could heighten the impact of the strike? So where are those choke points and vulnerability? So if you were to go on strike, if you were to organize collective action, including a strike, where would you apply that pressure? Where would you want to get, for example, uh, workers best organized? And also, where would you want to circulate the struggle? What other workplaces would you want others to act simultaneously with you? This can have ramifications that disrupt the supply chain and spreads, kind of like a virus, spreads across different workplaces. Even if those workplaces are run by different employers. The second question, so you want to ask first, where are those choke points, potential choke points and vulnerability? The second question is, how can the strike spread to involve other workers or students, patients, the working class more generally, by exercising workers' power? So where do you want to spread that? So I kind of got ahead of myself a little bit. So identify the choke points and vulnerabilities along your supply chain. And then the second question is, where do you want to spread that strike or that struggle? And then the third question to ask yourself is, what additional information do you need to make your action more effective? So in other words, what do you still have to do in terms of developing new tactics and strategies to recompose your power in your own workplace? So what other information do you need? And then go out to get it. And this is, for example, how many unionized workers are there and non-unionized workers? How many workers are organized informally? I think anytime workers are organized, to me, that's a union. But we tend to make this dichotomy between union, non-union. But where are workers organized? Where are they not organized? Where are they members of unions? Where are they not members of unions? How many immigrant or native-born workers are there in the workplace? What are the different languages? What are the different grassroots leaders in the workplace? Who are they? Can they bring people along because they have people that really rely on them for leadership? What are the rules in the workplace? What is the labor law that applies? All these different aspects of understanding the organization of work. So I hope that this is helpful for everyone. This is something you can do on your own, and ideally, the process of carrying out a workers' inquiry is an actual organizing effort. So doing the inquiry is a way to build your power, your capacity, and help you identify how you can further build your power. So I'm now open if there's any questions, if anyone wants to ask. 10 minutes left. Okay. Where are we at? All right. So I don't know if there's any questions, but I'm happy to stick around and for the next 9 minutes. And I do want to say that if you would like to see the flow chart that I wasn't able to share with you, I've done this talk a number of other times. You're welcome to go on to YouTube and find it, and you'll see an image of that flow chart. Or like I said, you can also contact me, look me up, and I'm happy to send it to you. So I understand that if you do have any questions, feel free to post it on Twitch. Thank you, Ellie. I'm actually looking for the link, and I think I might have the link to share with folks. Okay. So I'll put the link into another video that we did where we showed the flow chart, and you can go to the end of the video and you'll see the flow chart there. So it doesn't look like there's any questions or any comments or thoughts or suggestions. If anyone is interested in ordering a copy of the book, I think I have a discount code that might still be usable. Yes, okay. I haven't used this, and I was given it several months ago for different talks, but I'm going to put that in there. If you are interested in ordering the book, you can try to use that discount code when you go to the Pluto Press website. Okay, well, thank you for hosting me, and it was a pleasure. Although it's really, really early in the United States, I'm happy to join you. And please get in touch if you do carry out a workers' inquiry, or if you are doing them now, or if you need help in any way. Feel free to track me down and let me know how it's going for you. So I hope everyone's well out there. Bye-bye.